But Somaliland's story
Right.
is often kind of pushed to the side,
Yeah.
and especially their legal fight for recognition,
Yeah.
which, as we'll find out, is really full of twists and turns.
Okay, so let's start with what seems like a pretty simple event.
Okay.
Somaliland's independence.
Sounds simple enough.
So picture this, June 26, 1960,
1960.
newspapers all over the world.
Wow.
I'm talking the New York Times,
Big ones.
the Iraq Times,
Okay.
even the Somali Gazette.
Yeah.
They're all printing headlines about this newly independent nation.
Wow.
There are pictures of people celebrating in the streets,
Okay.
a real sense of hope for the future.
Yeah, you can feel it.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, on the surface at least.
Okay.
And we have UN Resolution 1418 that lays it all out.
Oh.
We even have maps from the time
Right.
that show the territory under Italian administration.
Okay. So we already have this potential for some conflict brewing, right?
You're absolutely right.
Somaliland comes in with these established borders.
Yeah.
And Somalia's boundaries are...
Who doesn't?
Yeah, you can kind of see how that would lead to problems
Exactly.
down the road.
And
Okay, so they just decided to become one country.
that's what we're told.
Oh, okay.
But when you start looking at the details, the official narrative starts to fall apart.
So it's like a hidden clause in a contract,
That's all.
something that changes the whole game. To make things even weirder,
Yeah.
we've got reports from the time,
Oh, really?
like a CIA report,
Okay.
an article from the Daily Telegraph,
Wow.
both saying that Somalia actually refused
Fuse.
to sign a bilateral agreement for unification.
That is strange. And I think it points to some legal inconsistencies
Right.
at the heart of this whole union.
Yep.
So you've got Somalia's reluctance to sign a treaty.
Right.
On top of that, there's evidence that there were two different versions of this act of union.
Two different versions of the same act.
Yeah. Neither one seems to have been legally binding.
So let's take a close look at this Somali Act of Union because it gets even more problematic.
Okay, how so?
It was never ratified by
Yeah.
any legislature.
Oh, wow.
It was basically a presidential decree.
So just one person signed it?
Yeah, signed by the interim president
Okay.
of this newly created republic,
So it wasn't even really official.
basically.
That's interesting.
But they didn't stop there.
Oh, no.
It gets worse.
Oh, boy.
In 1961, the Mogadishu government,
Oh,
with help from Italian legal advisors,
interesting.
tried to retroactively legitimize this union.
So they tried to change the past with a new law.
Exactly.
That's almost always considered illegal. You can't just change past agreements after the fact.
So we've got Somaliland,
Yeah.
this nation with its own independence
Internationally recognized independence.
and clearly defined borders
Oh, yeah.
being pulled into this union
Yeah.
based on what sounds like a legally dubious document
At best.
and some creative lawmaking.
Yeah.
What were they thinking?
I think to understand that, we need to introduce you to someone
Okay.
who had a front row seat to all of this.
All right.
Paolo Contini.
Palcantini. Okay.
And he wasn't just any legal expert.
Okay.
He was tasked by the UN
Wow.
to actually write the constitution
For this new republic.
for this newly formed Somali Republic.
Okay.
And luckily for us,
Yeah.
he wrote about his experiences
Oh, wow.
in a book called The Somali Republic,
Yeah.
an experiment in legal integration.
Okay, so he was right there watching all of this happen.
Yeah, he was right there.
Wow.
He saw all the legal gymnastics firsthand.
So we've got this forced union based on shaky legal ground,
Yeah,
a lack of transparency,
right. Independence referendum. This referendum, at least on paper,
right on paper.
was supposed to be a simple yes or no vote
Makes sense.
on their new constitution. But the results were so one-sided. It raised a ton of red flags immediately. And almost immediately, there were accusations of rigging, especially from Somaliland.
Somali man.
So right away, something's not right.
Definitely fishy.
So as we started digging into all these documents,
Right, all those sources.
two names kept popping up over and over.
Okay, and who are they?
Giuseppe Papale and Maria Tucci.
Italian names.
Yeah, both Italians. And get this,
Okay, what's the catch?
they both held super important positions in the Somali government.
What positions?
Paul Pale was actually the president of the Supreme Court,
Court?
the very institution tasked with validating those referendum results.
Very interesting.
And then you have Tucci.
What about him?
He was a high-ranking official,
Okay, high rank.
but with ambitions for a UN position.
So even higher ambitions.
Exactly, and here's where it gets even more shady. He had deep connections to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
So basically,
Italy might have still been trying to pull strings.
even after Somalia was independent.
It definitely looks that way.
Wow.
Some sources flat out say that Popole and Tucci
Those two Italian guys.
were basically agents for the Italian government.
Agents. You mean spies?
Not necessarily spies.
Okay, then what?
More like they were following orders to make sure the referendum went a certain way.
To benefit Italy.
To benefit Italy.
That's messed up.
It really is. And it goes even deeper than just politics.
Deeper how?
Remember, strategic location, untapped potential.
It's a real prize.
Exactly. And Italy had been super involved in shaping Somalia's laws
Their laws.
and their constitution, even during the transition to independence.
So maybe Somalia wasn't truly independent.
It makes you question how much control they actually had.
Big questions for sure.
So we've got Italy potentially trying to control Somalia.
Right, like puppet masters.
Yeah, the sources suggest they were deeply involved in shaping Somalia's political scene,
Involved how?
especially in the years leading up to the referendum,
Like where?
particularly during the 1958 elections. A textbook case of neocolonialism.
Hold on. What's neocolonialism again?
It's basically when powerful countries control former colonies.
Control them how?
Not directly, but through things like economics, politics, even culture.
It's like a sneaky kind of control.
Exactly. Maintaining control under the guise of aid or development.
So they're pretending to help.
But really, they're pulling the strings behind the scene. Orchestrated the removal of the Somali Youth League's president.
Wait, they just removed the president.
There are claims that they did.
That's wild.
His name was Hagi Mohammed,
Hagi Mohammed.
and they replaced him with a guy named Aden Abdullah.
Why would they do that?
The sources suggest they wanted someone more aligned with their interests.
More willing to play ball.
Exactly. Someone they could influence more easily.
So Italy's manipulating the referendum.
Meddling in the elections.
And this whole neocolonialism thing is looming large.
It paints a pretty bleak picture. And it gets even worse because there was at least one person within the UN
One person.
who tried to raise the alarm bells.
Really? Who?
A Philippine representative named Barati.
Okay, Barati, he trying to speak up.
He voiced concerns about the lack of a proper census.
That's important for a fair vote.
And he pointed out the disregard for the rule of law.
So someone saw the red flags.
But the sources say he was largely ignored.
Ignored by the UN.
Some even suggest his reports were suppressed.
So they silenced him.
It's hard to say for sure.
But it's not looking good for the UN.
Not at all.
So we've got Italy and now the UN potentially involved in this mess.
It's a tangled web for sure. Let's get into the nitty-gritty.
The how-to manual for rigging an election.
Exactly. How did they actually pull off this massive manipulation?
Well, it seems like they used every trick in the book.
Give us some examples.
We're talking classic ballot stuffing.
Old school but effective.
But then it gets more sinister.
How so?
Coercion, intimidation, you name it.
Wow, so people were being forced to vote a certain way.
It seems that way.
And there are even reports of votes being cast in the names of dead people.
Dead people? Seriously?
Yeah, and it gets even crazier.
Crazier how?
There are accounts of votes being cast for livestock.
You're kidding, right? Animals voting.
It sounds ridiculous, I know.
It does, but it's also kind of terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. They're so blatant about it.
It makes you wonder what else they were capable of.
Right. It's like they weren't even trying to hide it.
And these accusations are coming from everywhere.
Multiple sources.
Different political groups, eyewitnesses, even whispers from the international community.
It's hard to ignore that kind of widespread consensus.
It's a pattern, and it points to a deeply flawed process. You've really handed us quite a stack of material on Somaliland and Somalia.
Yeah.
It's history, international reports, modern analysis, some opinions and it seems like there's a lot more to this than just, a simple border dispute. So, Somaliland, Somalia situation.
It really is fascinating how both sides have these completely, opposite narratives of what went down. Right? Somaliland says it was never legally part of Somalia, and Somalia sees it as like a breakaway region.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, you've got this, 2005 report from this African Union fact-finding mission.
Right.
And they say it pretty clearly right up front.
Yeah.
The union between Somaliland and Somalia, they say, was never ratified. It's pretty strong language from a group like the African Union, don't you think?
It is. It is. And that's why this report's really so significant. I mean, Somaliland's arguing that there was never a legally binding agreement to be part of Somalia to begin with.
Yeah.
And the lack of ratification really goes to the heart of that.
Yeah.
Makes you think, if they couldn't even agree on that, why even attempt a union?
Yeah, and digging through some of these declassified CIA documents that you pulled for us.
Right.
There was one from July 1960, so this is just days before Somalia gained independence, and it reveals that Somaliland and Somalia, they couldn't agree on who would hold any of the top leadership positions in this new government.
Oh, wow.
So it's like
Red flags.
yeah, I mean, was this doomed from the start?
Well, it makes you question whether there was ever a genuine intention to create a unified nation to begin with. This wasn't just some, small disagreement. This was a very fundamental power struggle that was present even before.
Right, from the get-go.
Even before the Union.
So we've got no ratified Union agreement. Right.
We've got major disagreements on leadership. And then there's this question of the missing treaty.
Yeah, the missing treaty, right. You would think if they had a union, there would be a treaty.
I would assume so.
A signed treaty, registered with the UN.
Of course, you'd have
as required by international law. But from what I've seen, there is no evidence that such a document
ever even exists,
yeah. And without a registered treaty, I mean, Somalia's legal claim to Somaliland is
pretty shaky.
It weakens considerably. It's like trying to claim you own a house, but you have no deed.
Right. And then you've got, you look at when the Somali Republic was admitted to the UN.
Yeah.
This was back in 1961. And they're admitted as the Republic of Somalia.
Interesting.
Not the Somali Republic.
And not the law.
Which would have acknowledged a union with Somaliland.
Yeah, that's a subtle but significant distinction, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it makes you wonder, like, if there was no real union in the first place. In fact, I was looking at some British documents.
Oh, really?
And they indicated that Somalilanders weren't even legally considered citizens of Somalia until much later.
Really?
So you've got this paradox, right? How can you be part of a nation if you're not even recognized as a citizen?
That must have caused all sorts of legal problems.
Oh, it did. Even impacted the outcome of the Somaliland Scouts Rebellion, which happened in 1961.
Oh, wow.
There were participants in that rebellion that were acquitted simply because they weren't Somali citizens at the time. It just underscores how messy this union was.
Legally speaking.
From a legal standpoint, yeah.
So we've got a missing treaty, we've got questions surrounding the whole citizenship thing.
Right.
And this union that seems incredibly fragile.
Yeah, shake.
From the very beginning. So we've uncovered some pretty big questions about the legal basis for this union.
Right.
But even if we set aside the legal stuff for a second, what other arguments are there against recognizing Somaliland?
Well, a common one you hear is that it could set a dangerous precedent. It could encourage other separatist movements.
Oh, I see, yeah.
All around the world.
Like the domino effect?
Kind of, yeah, like opening Pandora's box.
But couldn't you argue that Somaliland's case is kind of unique?
Yeah.
I mean, they were independent before the union, and as we've been discussing, that union's pretty messed up from the start.
Problematic, to say the least, yeah.
Yeah.
And Somaliland really plays up that point. They frame their quest not as secession,
right,
but as a restoration of their previous independent status.
Makes sense.
And, looking at their history, it does lend weight to that argument.
But there are also concerns that this could destabilize Somalia even more. But isn't ignoring Somaliland also contributing to the instability? Like by just keeping things the way they are we just delaying the inevitable?
Well, that's the heart of the dilemma.
Let's unpack that. What are some of the, the benefits that recognition could bring for Somaliland?
Well, for Somaliland, recognition would be a huge win.
Yeah.
I mean, it would formally acknowledge their sovereignty,
right,
give them a place on the world stage.
They're like their own seat at the table.
Exactly. Exactly. They could open embassies, they could join international organizations, participate in global affairs as an independent nation.
Yeah, it's like night and day.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And you can't overstate the symbolic significance of that. I mean, it would be an incredible testament to their resilience after decades of struggle.
It would be inspiring.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it's not just symbolic, right? There's the economic side of things too.
Oh, absolutely. Right now, Somaliland exists in this sort of limbo. They can't fully engage in the global economy.
Right, they're shut out of.
They are. They're cut off from international aid, trade agreements, foreign investment.
So recognition would change that?
Yeah, it could. It could open those doors for them.
Yeah.
Attract foreign companies, allow them to develop their natural resources.
Provide jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It could lead to an economic transformation for Somaliland.
And we've talked about how Somaliland's got this record of relative stability and peace in a region that's known for a lot of conflict.
Right.
So could recognition actually make the Horn of Africa safer?
That's a key argument that proponents of recognition make, yeah.
Okay.
You know, Somaliland has shown that they can govern themselves, provide security.
Yeah.
So strengthening Somaliland could actually help combat terrorism and piracy, which are huge problems in the region.
Right.
They could become a really valuable partner in international security efforts.
Wow. Okay, so we're seeing potential benefits for Somaliland, for the region, maybe even for the world. But what about Somalia? How would they react to all of this?
It is possible that Somalia, if faced with an independent Somaliland,
Yeah.
they might eventually come to accept it. Maybe even see it as a way to move on from this past conflict
Right.
and focus on building their own future.
That would be amazing.
It would.
Yeah.
It really would.
Yeah.
Because in June of 1960, Somaliland actually gains independence from British rule. So think about that for a second. They were their own recognized country. They had a government. They had treaties filed with the UN, the whole 9 yards.
Right. And we actually have this New York Times article from June 26th of that year.
Wow.
And it really captures the mood at the time. You know, everyone's celebrating. There's all this hope in the air. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Things kind of went south pretty quickly.
They did.
Yeah.
In fact, there's this article from La Stampa that was published on July 5th, 1960,
Okay.
just a few days after that New York Times piece. And already you can see the cracks starting to emerge.
Oh, really?
Somalilanders were starting to feel sidelined, like their voices weren't being heard. And Somalis were starting to take over most of the top government positions.
There was no formal agreement for this union. And they even used the word annexed, which is pretty strong language.
It is strong language because according to international law, you can't just merge two countries without a treaty, a real ratified agreement.
Right.
And here's where it gets wild. There's actually no proof that a treaty like that between Somaliland and Somalia ever even existed.
Wait, hold on. No treaty. But how did they even...
Right.
How's that allowed to happen?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And to this day, we still don't know, but we do have evidence that such a treaty did not exist.
Okay.
We even checked the UN treaty series from September 1960. Nothing. It's like this whole union was built on just a handshake and a hope.
A handshake and a hope. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So no legal foundation. I bet that had some serious consequences for the people of Somaliland, right?
Oh, absolutely. For starters, what did it even mean to be a Somalilander in this new Somali Republic?
Other documents showing that as late as August 1960, Somalilanders still weren't even considered citizens of this new republic.
Yeah.
It's like they went from being citizens of their own country to, I don't know, like non-entities.
Yeah, it was a complete mess. And this whole citizenship fiasco actually played a role in acquitting Somaliland soldiers who had rebelled against the Union in 1961. Their argument was basically, we don't legally belong to this republic, so why should we have to follow its orders? And the courts agreed.
Wow, that's a good point.
It is a good point.
And even a Daily Telegraph article from July 5th, 1960 talks about how dangerous and chaotic those unity talks actually were.
Yeah.
So Somalia's got to be aware at this point of
Right.
this giant legal hole that they've dug. What do?
So in 1961, they tried to fix things, or at least make it look like they were legit all along.
Okay.
They draft a constitution, they hold a referendum to try and legitimize the Union retroactively.
I bet there's a catch.
There's a massive catch.
And we have the sources to prove it right.
We do.
Sources showing that this referendum was rejected by political parties on both sides, voting irregularities.
Yeah.
The whole thing was just a giant
A
mess.
giant mess that somehow gets approved by the Supreme Court in Mogadishu. But here's the kicker. The court at that time was staffed entirely by Italian judges.
Hold on, Italian judges.
Yeah.
That seems a bit convenient, don't you think?
Well, when you factor in that we have declassified Italian documents that reveal these judges were actually working for the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs,
Oh, wow.
it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
And let's not forget that Italy also had massive economic interest in Somalia.
So Italy, which had its own agenda, basically helped rig the legal system to ensure Somalia's control over Somaliland.
Right. To make matters even more suspicious, There's evidence that Italy actively discouraged Somalia from joining the Commonwealth just so they could maintain their own influence.
So we have a sham referendum.
Mm-hmm.
We have a court with questionable impartiality.
Yeah.
A powerful foreign nation pulling strings.
Uh-huh.
No wonder this union was on shaky ground from day one.
But tragically, it took decades of suffering
Right.
for the people of Somaliland before that collapse finally came. And that's where things take a truly dark turn.
Yeah. So we've established this union was built on some pretty shaky foundations, legally and politically.
Right.
But I have to ask, like, what happened to the people of Somaliland during all this?
Sadly, their story during those decades under Somali rule is one of oppression and violence.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about political disagreements here. We're talking about human rights abuses on a massive scale.
Right, and we have some pretty disturbing sources that back this up, like
Yeah.
that 1982 report that details the trial of doctors, teachers, other prominent figures in Hargeisa. They were accused of undermining the state, but it's clear from the report that they were really just silenced for speaking out.
Exactly. It was a blatant attempt to crush any form of dissent.
Yeah.
And then there's the horrifying discovery of mass graves in Hargeisa in 1997.
Right.
That UN report we have, it paints a chilling picture.
It concludes that the Somali government systematically targeted the Isaac clan, committing what can only be described as genocide.
Right.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of the suffering.
It's a truly dark chapter. And what makes it even more disturbing is the lack of accountability.
Right.
Those responsible for these atrocities have largely escaped justice.
It's unbelievable that something so horrific could go unpunished.
It is.
We know that Somaliland's first president, after they reclaimed their independence, Mohammed Ibrahim Igal, he actually appealed to the UN in 1997,
Wow.
urging them to investigate the genocide.
Right.
He knew that to prevent future atrocities, there had to be accountability.
He was absolutely right, and you can really see his frustration in the sources we have. He talks about the need to break this culture of impunity.
Right.
But despite a preliminary UN study confirming the genocide, the international community basically shrugged their shoulders,
So they just moved on,
pretty much.
leaving Somaliland to deal with the trauma and the lack of closure.
It's a heartbreaking reality. And get this, just a few years ago, the newly formed Somali government actually tried to grant diplomatic immunity to officials implicated in the genocide.
Wait, seriously? They tried to shield the perpetrators?
Yeah, a letter from the Somali government to the U.S. Embassy in Kenya,
Uh-huh.
specifically requesting immunity for a former official involved in the atrocities.
It's like they were trying to rewrite history,
Right.
to erase the genocide from the record.
It's appalling.
Yeah.
It seems like the pursuit of justice for Somaliland is constantly hitting roadblocks.
Yeah, it's like the world is more interested in rebuilding Somalia than acknowledging the pain they inflicted.
There's definitely a sense of that.
Yeah.
And it feeds into this frustrating narrative that you see in the media and international reports,
Yeah.
where Somaliland is often labeled as a breakaway republic or a secessionist state.
Right, as if there's some rogue entity that just decided to go it alone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It completely ignores the historical and legal realities we've been talking about.
Right.
Somaliland isn't breaking away from anything. They're reclaiming a sovereignty that was stolen.
We've established there was never a legitimate union in the first place.
Right.
Their Declaration of Independence in 1991 was a return to their pre-existing statehood, not some illegal separation.
Precisely. And this whole breakaway narrative just delegitimizes their struggle and makes it harder for them to gain recognition on the world stage.
It also perpetuates this idea that Somaliland's story can only be told through the lens of Somalia. They're denied their own voice, their own agency.
It's time for a different perspective.
Yeah.
The world needs to recognize Somaliland for what it is. A nation that not only endured unimaginable suffering, but has also managed to build a functioning democracy
Right.
and a relatively peaceful society in a region riddled with conflict.
And we have plenty of sources that demonstrate this, right? Somaliland has held multiple free and fair elections since 1991. They have a functioning government, a growing economy.
They even have international agreements, like that prisoner exchange treaty with Seychelles we mentioned earlier.
Right.
These are all signs that Somaliland is operating as a sovereign state, meeting the criteria laid out in international law.
So the real question is, why is the world so hesitant to grant them the recognition they clearly deserve?
Frankly, a lot of it comes down to plain old ignorance.
Yeah.
People just don't know enough about Somaliland's unique situation.
It's like they're being punished for being a victim,
Right.
and then for having the audacity to rebuild themselves.
It's a cruel irony. and it speaks to the challenges faced by so many post-colonial nations trying to assert their rightful place in the world.
Yeah.
But Somaliland is not giving up, and their story is far from over.
So we've really gone deep on this one. From Somaliland's initial independence and then that troubled union with Somalia to the fight for recognition and the quest for justice after the genocide.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process.
It is. Somaliland's story really forces us to grapple with some tough questions about history and how we define sovereignty, and frankly, about how the world really works when it comes to international relations.
Yeah, I'm also struck by how this whole thing exposes the shortcomings of the international community. Like, they knew about the genocide. There were reports like, pleas for help.
Right.
But nothing really happened. And then there's this ongoing refusal to recognize Somaliland's sovereignty, even though they seem to check all the boxes. It's a bit disheartening, to be honest. So where do we go from here? What does this mean for Somaliland in the long run? And what can we do as people who are now informed about this situation to make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, we have to keep talking about Somaliland.
Right.
Their story needs to be heard, not just by academics or policy wonks, but by everyone. The more people who understand what's going on, the more pressure we can put on governments and organizations to do the right thing.
So awareness is key. Got it. What else can we do?
Supporting organizations that are working in Somaliland is another way to make an impact. There are groups focused on human rights, on advocating for international recognition, on helping Somaliland develop its economy and infrastructure. Every bit helps.
And I bet contacting our elected officials, letting them know that we care about this issue and want them to support Somaliland, that can't hurt either.
Right, absolutely.
We
Those actions might seem small on an individual level, but when enough people speak up, it can really shift the conversation. Somaliland's journey is far from over, but with enough internal determination and support from the outside world, I'm confident they can achieve their goals.
It's pretty inspiring when you think about it. They went through so much, but they never gave up on rebuilding their nation and pursuing justice.
It really is. Somaliland's story is a testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity, to hold on to hope even in the darkest of times, and to never stop fighting for what you believe in.
Well, that was a deep dive indeed. And honestly, it was a privilege to learn about Somaliland's history and the challenges they face.